Hi, my name is Jessica King, and I'm going to talk to you today about sense making in enacted environments. And we're going to look at how sense making can help you or hurt you in crisis situations. And we're going to reference the Bhopal disaster of 1984. And if you haven't heard about that, I'll tell you a little bit about it. In the late 70s, Union Carbide built some production facilities for pesticides. One in particular was in Bhopal, India. And by the early 80s, demand for the pesticide had really decreased. And so this particular production facility was converted into a storage facility. And a lot, with getting rid of the production facilities, a lot of the staff was let go. Maintenance and commitment to that facility had decreased, and it had an impact not only on the people there, but on the facility and infrastructure itself. So what happened was a storage tank started leaking toxic gas, and it hurt over 500,000 people. It's an estimate that, over 8,000 people died within several weeks, and then maybe 8,000 more died since from gas-related diseases. And so what happened was there was some maintenance work being done by one shift. They had left some water running. They were flushing some tanks. They noted that in their logbook, so the second shift could come in and take over that and turn the water off. Some decisions were made or not made, and it was found later that the water was going into the tank, creating pressure, and had a chemical reaction. The pressure got too big in the tank, and the gas started to leak. Now, there were some indications that the gas had started to leak, and you had some gauges that had been malfunctioning for years at this point. So you really couldn't rely on, are the gauges accurate or not? But there was some tearing of the eyes and some smell that people were able to smell, but a lot of that was dismissed because they weren't expecting to have this type of problem and didn't know how this could even happen. So they weren't prepared and had no plan to deal with this type of situation, especially of this magnitude. So what we're going to talk about is how when you're faced with crisis situations, your normal thought process and logic that you used, it may not apply. You've got to decide really quickly if you're going to act at all or if you're not. And you need to understand that any action you take has the potential to make the problem worse. And how we respond really depends on our sense-making abilities. The more effective we are at sense-making, the less likely that crisis will get out of control. A lot of times these crisis situations you can't plan for, and the situations don't necessarily determine the action. A lot of times you'll have to act first, and then so really the situation is determining, your actions are determining the situation, and your preconception determines what kind of action is actually taken. So what is enactment? Enactment is a synthesis of self-fulfilling prophecies, retrospective sense-making, commitment, and social information processing. So when people act, they bring events and structures into existence and set them into motion. And an enacted environment is the residuum changes as the result of enactment. Anything that happens has significance and has to be considered. You can't eliminate any possibility because it could trigger some kind of action or reaction. The result of enactment is not by accident. It's not a byproduct. It is an orderly material social construction that is subject to lots of different interpretations. Enacted environments contain real things. So in the Bhopal case, that's like pipes and gauges. Their existence, whether they're functioning or not, their significance is not questioned, usually until it's incorporated into a significant event or consequence. So let's talk about enactment perspective to crisis. So what we've already kind of talked about is that we might not know what the appropriate actions to take are, and we can make crises worse before we've even realized what we've done. And this is especially true when technology is complex, duties are non-routine, and either the job or the situation is poorly understood. Human errors fundamentally are caused by our human variability. We're all different, we all think different and act different. Therefore, we cannot design every possible situation away. We can only understand how to better be prepared to make decisions in those crises. Another example, aside from the Bhopal example, is the Oklahoma City bombing. No one expected a crisis like that to unfold on April 19th, 1995. But what you did find is that as soon as the explosion occurred, while there were people running away, there were a lot of people running to the scene. Now, these people really had no idea what was going on. They didn't know what would happen. When they got there, they didn't have any idea of the size of the disaster. And so they were acting. They weren't thinking, they were acting, and their actions were going to determine next what happened in the sequence and sense making and dealing with the crisis. Now we'll look at how you measure effectiveness of enactment in a crisis. We'll look at capacity and commitment. Commitment in a crisis reveals itself through justifications of our actions. Justifications provide sufficient structure so that people can better create a fuller picture of what's going on and the actions they should take. Once we are committed to an action and have justifications for those actions, we produce blind spots for those actions to be considered a contributor to crisis. So, for example, if a pressure gauge is not known to operate correctly 100% of the time, the last thing someone is going to think is that it's accurate. This creates blind spots, and that prevents us from considering contributors to a crisis until it's far advanced. So capacity. The concept of capacity and enactment affects crisis management through perception, distribution of competence, and control within a hierarchy. People act in crisis because they believe they have the capacity to make an impact. The ability to perceive a threat depends on the belief that you can effectively counter whatever the threat is. Someone who is skilled in one area may have limited perception. For example, if my job is to go look for leaks, I may not even know or be aware if a temperature is completely out of line. Or if something's making a noise, I may not know that that may be an indicator of something else. While a job expert may see variances and identify potential crisis before it gets out of control, capacity also affects how someone may feel like they're not qualified to make a decision. At the same time, leaders may not be the most competent to make the decision either. Turnover and understaffing reduces institutional knowledge and experience. And when there's a lack of institutional knowledge, decisions are made based on experience irrelevant to current situations. So that can be super dangerous. Expectations for effective crisis management. So in an environment of effective crisis management, people have an awareness of how their actions generate their environments. There's a wider perspective of potential causes and opportunities where interventions are possible, and a balance of action and inaction with interest in diagnosis. To effectively prepare for future crisis, we have to look at all possible human contributions in hopes that we can identify any previously unnoticed contributing factors and make those adjustments. And the situation at Bhopal is a great example of how human sense-making impacts a crisis and the effect of commitment and capacity. In that case, the symptoms of a potential disaster went unnoticed and they were dismissed because of capacity and commitment issues. Studying the events at Bhopal and the impact of sense-making helps us illustrate the ideology of enactment and reducing the likelihood of a crisis. Now let's talk about the organizational lessons that we've learned. The use of sense-making in a crisis has to be a substantial amount in order to avoid chaos. The management of knowledge in these situations can help mitigate unnecessary chaos. When an organization develops a system to identify who needs to be informed of certain information, they're able to work more effectively. In the Bhopal case, if management had agreed to give staff more exposure and well-rounded training to the plant on a regular basis, the malfunction would have been discovered earlier. Having a variety of different skill sets with eyes on the operation could have mitigated the issue altogether. In the text, the analyst of enactment suggests that individual actions can cause a crisis, but also manage it to a lower level. Organizations really should be proactive when it comes to mitigating chaos. If processes are implemented to handle crisis, the event can be handled similar to an audit. When management is dedicated to avoiding these situations, they're staying on the front end of problem solving. If a structure has been put into place before the Bhopal case, the staff would have had a guide on communicating the crisis to the appropriate party. potentially avoiding an increase in the severity of the issue, how to evacuate, how to clean up. Proper staffing at the facility would have included a safety personnel who would be in charge of orchestrating these types of emergency measures. The burden of responsibility handling these situations does not always fall on the manager, as the manager, like we said earlier, is not always the most competent person to make a decision. Preparation, awareness of risk, and the appropriate leadership and management are key in sense making.